Classical conditioning, also called Pavlovian conditioning, is the focus of this tricky topic. Classical conditioning is one type of associative learning whereby a connection is formed between two different sources of information. More specifically, classical conditioning occurs when a neutral stimulus becomes associated with one for which one has an automatic inborn response. So the types of behaviors involved in classical conditioning are involuntary responses, and psychologists often refer to these as reflexive behaviors. What are some examples of reflexive behaviors, you might ask? One example is pain withdrawal. Say you happen upon this iron, because you have to iron an outfit for a wedding you're invited to. The iron has been conveniently left out, so you think that your roommate left it out for you. How considerate. You reach out to grab it and discover that it's really hot, so you pull your hand away. That's a reflexive behavior in response to pain. The next time you see an iron, it might automatically trigger an avoidance reaction because of your past experience. Emotional responses are considered to be mainly involuntary, which is one of the reasons that emotions are often so difficult to control. For instance, if you hear a sudden loud noise, it'll probably trigger an automatic startle response because it provokes fear. As you'll learn in this tricky topic, sometimes it's advantageous to know when something important is going to happen, so classical conditioning is all about attaching meaning, so that you can predict when things are going to happen, rather than passively responding to stimuli in the environment. Now, you can't get far learning about classical conditioning without learning about Ivan Pavlov, the guy who started all this. He was a Russian physiologist who was awarded the Nobel Prize in 1904 for his work on saliva and digestion. In his research, he measured salivation in dogs when given different types of food, like meat powder. He noticed that over time, the dogs would start drooling before they were given the meat powder, when the technician made the noise of assembling the equipment to measure their saliva. He hypothesized that the dogs made an association between the noise of preparing the equipment and the food that always followed. Rather than see this as a nuisance to his digestion research, he decided to investigate further and ask whether dogs could learn to salivate to other sounds. So this is what he did to test his hypothesis. Before conditioning, he found that the dogs would drool in response to meat, of course, because dogs find meat delicious. This is referred to as the unconditioned stimulus, or US, and the dog's response is called the unconditioned response, or UR. Unconditioned means unlearned or reflexive. Before conditioning, a neutral stimulus, like a non-delicious bell, does not produce salivation. He did all of this in the beginning of his experiment to make sure that dogs don't respond to bells with drooling. This is pretty careful science. Now, during conditioning, the neutral stimulus is presented just before the unconditioned stimulus, and as expected, the dog salivates, just as it did when the US was presented alone. If this pairing is repeated enough times, then the dog now salivates upon hearing the bell. So this has now become the conditioned stimulus, or CS, and the dog's response to this new learned cue is called the conditioned response, or CR. Through many careful experiments, Pavlov and his research group worked out two fundamental rules of classical conditioning. First, multiple pairings of the US, or natural stimulus, and the CS, or neutral stimulus, are necessary in order for the CS to take on the association. Second, the CS and US must be presented close together in time, and works best when the CS occurs just before the US, so it can act as a predictor. Now, classical conditioning can change once it's established, in ways that can tell us what's going on in the mind of the learner. For instance, we know that stimuli that are similar to the CS will also trigger the behavior, a phenomenon known as stimulus generalization, and it can tell us what types of things an individual finds similar. This is actually really handy in determining the sensory abilities of individuals who can't speak, such as animals or babies. On the other end of the spectrum is stimulus discrimination, whereby the response is restricted to the original CS, and this can be achieved by presenting the CS with the US, but presenting the other stimuli on their own without any interesting or meaningful associations. Stimulus discrimination training tells us what individuals consider different, and it's a big part of training drug sniffer dogs and hero rats, who learn to specifically detect the smell of explosives. So stimulus discrimination can weaken the ability of a certain stimuli to trigger a learned response, but a learned response can be weakened further by the process of extinction. Extinction is the disappearance of the CR when the CS and the US are no longer paired. So recall that when Pavlov repeatedly presented a bell with meat, the dog, of course, salivated. If the conditioning was successful, then the first time the bell was presented alone, the dog salivated. But if after learning the bell was presented repeatedly on its own without the meat, what happened? Did the dogs keep the CS-US association forever? The answer is no, that the learned response eventually weakens and disappears. So, the CR doesn't hang around forever when the CS is presented alone. But is learning completely reversed? Are we now using a blank slate for learning? This figure shows the strength of the CR on the y-axis here, and what happens during training, and during extinction when the CS is presented alone. When extinction is complete, it's almost as if the learning never happened at all. However, Pavlov showed that if the CS is presented alone again after a delay, the CR will spontaneously recover, although the size of the response is generally weaker. Therefore, it's likely that extinction suppresses learning, but doesn't erase it. Pavlov's findings sparked all sorts of research on classical conditioning. American psychologist John Watson felt so strongly that he set out to test whether classical conditioning could be used to shape human behavior. In his now notorious study of little Albert in 1920, Watson and colleague Rosemary Rayner conditioned a baby to fear a tame lab rat by presenting it just before a sudden loud noise. Little Albert learned to fear the rat, as well as other fluffy white objects. This showed that his conditioned fear generalized to other stimuli. Little Albert didn't undergo deconditioning, so this research sparked a lot of ethical controversy. However, Watson showed that fear can be learned, and many successful treatments for anxiety problems, such as phobias, are based upon unlearning conditioned fear responses. So there you have it, the basic building blocks of classical conditioning.